This is a fictional story inspired by real life. The morning of the reading of the last will and testament arrived with a chill that seemed to penetrate deeper than the frosty air of New York City. Eleanor Brooks opened her eyes after a night spent mostly in restless wakefulness, staring at the shadows dancing across her bedroom ceiling. It had been only a few quiet weeks since the passing of her beloved mother, Evelyn Brooks, and Eleanor still found it incredibly difficult to accept the reality that she would never hear that gentle, comforting voice again. At 72 years of age, Eleanor had certainly faced her fair share of difficult moments throughout her journey, experiencing deep losses and heavy disappointments that time had slowly faded, but absolutely nothing compared to the profound sense of emptiness she had carried inside her chest since Evelyn had departed from this world. Throughout her entire existence, her mother had been the one constant pillar of support, the single person who stood firmly by her side through every shifting tide. Whenever life grew complicated or overwhelming, Evelyn was there to listen with an open heart and without judgment. When something wonderful occurred, Evelyn was always the very first person to celebrate with genuine joy. Even when the rest of the world seemed to grow distant or cold, her mother remained a steady, unwavering light in the darkness. On that particular morning, as Eleanor quietly prepared herself to attend the formal reading of the legal documents, her thoughts were not consumed by questions of inheritance, financial wealth, or valuable properties. The only deep desire lingering in her soul was that her mother's true wishes be respected and honored by everyone involved. Before stepping out of her apartment, she paused to pick up a framed photograph resting on a small side table, a cherished image from decades past, showing herself and Evelyn smiling warmly in front of the family's old countryside home. For a few quiet seconds, she gazed at that faded photograph, feeling a tight knot form in her throat as the memories washed over her. But she took a deep, steadying breath, placed the picture securely in her handbag, and stepped out into the cold morning. The attorney's office was situated in a remarkably peaceful and historic neighborhood of the Grand City, a place where the bustling noise of the metropolis seemed to soften into a respectful quiet. When Eleanor arrived and stepped into the softly lit waiting area, she immediately noticed her two older sisters already seated on the plush leather chairs, looking as immaculate as ever. Margaret, the eldest, was dressed in exceptionally elegant attire, adorned with several pieces of fine gold jewelry that caught the light and sparkled brilliantly every single time she moved her manicured hands. Catherine, sitting right beside her, held her expensive smartphone tightly, constantly reviewing messages with a completely relaxed and indifferent expression painted across her face. Neither of them appeared to be particularly affected or burdened by the recent emotional wound of losing their mother, as if this gathering were merely an administrative chore rather than a solemn family milestone. Eleanor approached them with slow, deliberate steps and offered a quiet, polite greeting to break the ice between them. Margaret slowly lifted her gaze, offering a brief, practiced smile that felt far more like a social obligation than any genuine display of sisterly affection or warmth. Catherine barely murmured a word in response, briefly nodding her head before instantly returning her eyes to the glowing screen in her hand. The atmosphere in the room instantly became incredibly uncomfortable and tense, thick with an unspoken distance that had defined their relationship for decades. It had been many years since the three sisters had shared anything resembling true closeness, as sharp differences in character had divided them since their youth. Margaret had always possessed a strong desire to stand out above everyone else, craving status and admiration, while Catherine customarily followed Margaret's lead in almost every major decision, content to align herself with power. Eleanor, in sharp contrast to her older siblings, had always chosen to lead a much simpler, quieter life, focusing on meaningful connections rather than material success. As she sat in the silence, Eleanor remembered the countless occasions when Evelyn had tried her absolute best to keep the fragile family united, organizing holiday dinners, warm celebrations, and summer gatherings for years, yet the deep undercurrents of tension had never truly disappeared. A polite assistant eventually opened the heavy wooden door and announced that the family could now enter the main office for the meeting. The three sisters walked into a spacious room where the veteran attorney already awaited them, seated behind a grand mahogany desk that held several perfectly organized files and legal folders. The gentleman greeted them with sincere cordiality and requested that they take their seats, maintaining a professional yet compassionate demeanor. Eleanor accommodated herself in a comfortable chair, her eyes naturally drawing toward the thick documents resting on the desk as a wave of sadness mixed with nervous anticipation washed over her. The attorney began the proceedings by thoroughly explaining some of the standard legal details related to estate succession and family law in the state. After a few minutes, he officially confirmed that the last will and testament was entirely valid, properly signed, and that all necessary legal dispositions had been recorded correctly according to the law. Margaret appeared visibly impatient, tapping her fingers lightly against her handbag, while Catherine crossed her arms and watched the attorney with intense, focused attention, eager to hear the numbers. Finally, the highly anticipated moment arrived as the gentleman opened the primary folder and began to read the typed pages aloud. First, he detailed several minor legacies and small financial gifts destined for various nephews, old neighbors, and a few dedicated individuals who had kindly assisted Evelyn during her final long battle for health. Eleanor smiled softly upon hearing those familiar names, finding it completely characteristic of her generous mother to remember every single person who had shown her kindness in her final days. Then, the reading transitioned into the main allocations of the estate, and the atmosphere in the office sharpened significantly. The attorney announced that Margaret would inherit a tremendously large sum of money from the primary bank accounts, along with several valuable financial investments and stock portfolios. A satisfied, triumphant smile appeared on Margaret's face immediately, and she adjusted her golden bracelets with an air of victory. Catherine received next a magnificent collection of historic family jewelry, diverse high-value savings accounts, and several parcels of highly productive agricultural land that had belonged to the family for many decades. Catherine exchanged a deeply pleased, victorious look with her older sister, both of them silently celebrating their newfound immense wealth. Eleanor listened to the reading in absolute silence, waiting patiently for her name to be called, imagining that perhaps she would receive a modest share of the land or some small collective property. Then, the attorney continued reading the final clauses of the document, and his voice seemed to drop slightly in tone. According to the official text, the only single property assigned directly and exclusively to Eleanor was the old, weathered countryside house located in a small, isolated rural community several hours away from the city. Nothing else was mentioned for her. There were no financial investments, no significant bank accounts, and none of the valuable lands were shared with her. Only that one aging house that had not been inhabited in a permanent manner for years. During the next few seconds, an absolute heavy silence reigned supreme within the spacious room. Eleanor parboiled her eyes several times, trying hard to process the unexpected words she had just heard, wondering if she had somehow misunderstood the text. The attorney quietly confirmed the information, reviewing the paperwork once more before looking up with a sympathetic expression. There was absolutely no error or misprint in the text. The distribution was written exactly in that specific manner by the explicit, conscious will of Evelyn Brooks. Margaret was the very first person to break the heavy silence, attempting to disguise a mocking smile but failing to do so as a soft chuckle escaped her lips. Catherine did not bother to hide her immense satisfaction either, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of pity and smug triumph. Eleanor remained completely motionless in her chair, not feeling a single ounce of anger, but rather a profound, overwhelming sense of bewilderment and confusion. She had known her mother better than anyone else in the world, and Evelyn had always been an exceptionally just, fair, and thoughtful woman throughout her life. Because of that deep bond, Eleanor found it incredibly difficult to understand the logic behind such a starkly unequal decision. The attorney continued explaining various administrative details regarding titles and transfers, but Eleanor barely listened to the words, as her mind was completely occupied trying to find a reasonable explanation for her mother's choice. When the formal meeting finally concluded, the three sisters walked out of the attorney's office and stepped onto the quiet city street. The moment they crossed the threshold, Margaret let out a small, cruel laugh, and Catherine immediately imitated her, neither of them making the slightest effort to conceal their delight. Margaret commented aloud that she now possessed more than enough financial resources to realize several grand personal projects that she had been planning for years. Catherine spoke excitedly about selling some of her newly acquired lands to real estate developers for an immediate, massive profit. After a few moments of celebrating their fortune, both of them directed the conversation toward the distant countryside house, openly mocking the property. They remarked that the old structure barely had any market value, and commented that it would probably end up costing far more money to maintain and repair than any actual benefit it could ever generate. They even went so far as to openly wonder why Evelyn had decided to leave precisely that useless, broken-down property to Eleanor, laughing at the thought. Eleanor listened to their harsh words without offering a single response, and although the unkind comments hurt her deeply, she preferred to keep her silence and dignity intact. During the long journey back to her own modest apartment, Eleanor thought constantly and deeply about her mother's life and character. The more she reflected on the situation, the less sense she could find in the apparent unfairness of the inheritance. Evelyn Brooks never made important decisions at random, nor did she ever act out of neglect or spite. If she had left that specific countryside house specifically to her youngest daughter, there simply had to be a powerful reason hidden behind the choice. Perhaps the property held a profound secret, meaning that the others were completely incapable of understanding or appreciating. That intriguing idea began to grow and take root in her mind during the following hours, refusing to leave her. Upon arriving at her apartment, she gently took out the old photograph she had carried in her bag and observed it with intense scrutiny. The image showed the beautiful, rustic facade of the old home surrounded by ancient trees, and memories of her childhood summers came rushing back to her heart. She remembered her grandfather working happily on the land, and she could almost smell the delicious meals her mother used to cook while the entire family gathered around the wooden table. That house had been the vibrant stage for some of the absolute happiest moments of her entire life. While Margaret and Catherine were busy celebrating their financial fortunes in the city, Eleanor began to contemplate a completely different path. Perhaps it was time to leave the noise of the city behind and return to that sacred place. Perhaps she needed to walk through those quiet rooms, open the forgotten windows to the sunlight, and breathe the fresh air that had accompanied so many beautiful memories. That very night, she made a firm decision that would surprise everyone who knew her. She would not sell the property, nor would she let it crumble into dust. She was going to pack her things and move there permanently, determined to discover the true story behind her mother's final choice. 2 long weeks after the dramatic reading of the last will and testament, Eleanor finished packing the very last of her modest cardboard boxes into the back of a moving van. She did not possess an overwhelming amount of material belongings, as throughout the passing of the years, she had slowly learned the beautiful lesson of living happily with only what was truly necessary. While she stood on the sidewalk watching the driver secure the rear doors of the vehicle, she felt a complex mixture of nervous apprehension and quiet excitement fluttering in her chest. Most people in her social circle would have considered it an absolute act of madness to abandon the modern comforts and conveniences of New York City just to move into an aging, deteriorated house in a tiny, distant rural community. However, for Eleanor, that bold decision made perfect, undeniable sense deep within her soul. Ever since Evelyn's departure, a quiet, persistent voice inside her heart had been telling her that she belonged in that specific place, guiding her steps away from the city. She did not know exactly what she was searching for out there, perhaps a sense of profound peace, perhaps clear answers, or perhaps simply a way to feel close to her mother's spirit once again. The journey lasted for several hours as the large van moved steadily away from the urban sprawl. As they advanced along the winding highway, the landscape began to transform beautifully before her eyes. The tall concrete buildings and crowded streets slowly disappeared, replaced by wide, open green fields, ancient oak trees, and narrow, quiet country lanes. Eleanor gazed out of the passenger window as a flood of vivid memories arrived, one after another in her mind. She remembered traveling along these very same roads with her parents during the golden summer vacations of her youth, remembering the laughter, the shared family picnics, and the endless afternoons running freely through the vast fields that surrounded the property. It had been an incredibly long time since she had returned to this place to stay for more than just a few brief hours. When the familiar shape of the old countryside house finally appeared in the distance against the horizon, Eleanor felt her heart accelerate with deep emotion. The historic wooden construction was still standing proudly, but the cruel passage of the years had left evident, undeniable marks of neglect across its frame. A significant portion of the exterior white paint had peeled away from the wood, and some of the large windows looked completely opaque due to decades of accumulated dust and grime. The front garden was entirely covered in wild weeds, and several dry, heavy tree branches rested forgotten across the overgrown lawn. The shingled roof also showed clear signs of severe wear and tear from past winter storms. Even so, despite the visible decay, Eleanor felt a warm sensation wash over her that she had not experienced in a very long time. She felt completely and truly at home. The moving van came to a gentle stop right in front of the main entrance porch. Eleanor stepped down slowly from the vehicle and remained standing still for several seconds. quietly observing the grand facade of her new sanctuary. A gentle afternoon wind moved some dry leaves across the wooden porch, creating a soft, rustling sound. "I am finally back, Mom," she murmured softly to the empty air. No one answered her, of course, but speaking those simple words aloud brought an immediate, profound sense of tranquility to her spirit. When she unlocked the heavy front door and pushed it open, a small cloud of dust rose into the air, and the deep, nostalgic scent of old cedar wood filled her lungs. Everything inside appeared to be entirely frozen in time, exactly as if the world had stopped moving decades ago. The furniture still remained in the precise locations where she remembered it from her childhood. Some of the large armchairs were carefully covered by old white sheets to protect them from the sun. The family oil paintings still remained hanging proudly on the living room walls, and even the old wooden sideboard in the dining room still preserved several pieces of fine porcelain tableware that Evelyn had utilized during special family dinners for years. The hired movers began to bring in the heavy boxes, while Eleanor slowly walked through each room, reacquainting herself with the space. The kitchen was the very first place she visited, a room where she had spent countless hours learning from her mother. She gently closed her eyes for a few brief moments, and could almost imagine Evelyn standing by the stove, happily preparing a fresh pot of coffee while talking about ordinary, everyday topics. Then, she walked into the dining room, followed by the main living room, feeling that every single corner seemed to hold a precious hidden memory. As she advanced down the central hallway, she reached the door of the bedroom that had belonged to her mother when she was a young girl. The old door emitted a low, creaking sound as Eleanor gently pushed it open. Inside, she discovered beautifully crafted antique furniture covered by a fine layer of gray dust. Resting upon a wooden dresser, a framed family photograph caught her attention, and she picked it up carefully with both hands. In the faded image, Evelyn, her parents, and the three sisters appeared smiling warmly when they were very small children. Margaret was smiling brightly for the camera, Catherine held a beautiful porcelain doll tightly, and Eleanor appeared seated right next to Evelyn, holding her mother's hand. Looking at that photograph provoked a strange, deep sensation in Eleanor's chest. For a brief instant, she vividly recalled a specific conversation she had shared with her mother many years ago. Evelyn had told her that some people spend their entire lives chasing after material things that can be lost in a single moment, while others learn to truly value that which remains forever. At that time, as a young woman, Eleanor had not completely understood the profound meaning behind those words, but now, they began to return to her memory with incredible clarity. The following days were entirely dedicated to the arduous task of deep cleaning and restoration. From the very early hours of the morning until late in the afternoon, Eleanor worked tirelessly, organizing rooms, polishing old wooden furniture, and removing items that had been damaged by the relentless passage of time. Seeing the activity, some of the elderly neighbors from the quiet community began to walk over to the property to greet her and welcome her back. Many of them remembered her clearly from when she was a young girl visiting for the summer. Among them was an elderly gentleman named Mr. Thomas, a man of advanced years and quiet wisdom who had known Evelyn for many decades. "Your mother always loved this old house more than anything else," he told her one warm afternoon as he stood by the garden gate. "I know she did," Eleanor replied softly, wiping her brow, "but she hadn't lived here in a long time." Mr. Thomas looked at her with a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Well, she came here far more often than most people think, Eleanor." That unexpected phrase immediately caught Eleanor's attention, and she paused her work. "What do you mean, Mr. Thomas?" The old man appeared slightly taken aback by her reaction. "Oh, I thought you knew." During the last few years of her life, she came out here by herself several times. She would spend 3 or 4 quiet days alone in the house, and then return to the city. Eleanor frowned slightly, a wave of confusion washing over her. That was incredibly strange. Her mother had never once mentioned those frequent visits to anyone in the family. She tried to gather more information from the neighbor, but Mr. Thomas simply shrugged his shoulders, explaining that he did not know any specific details about what she did during those days. That mysterious conversation remained revolving around Eleanor's mind for the rest of the afternoon, sparking a deep curiosity. Why had Evelyn been visiting the isolated property in complete secrecy? What was she doing alone in the old house? Later that evening, while Eleanor was organizing some small family objects in a corner of the main living room, she suddenly heard a sharp, dry clicking sound originating from the dark corner of the room. She turned her head quickly toward the source of the noise. The sound appeared to be coming from a grand antique grandfather clock made of dark walnut wood that stood tall against the wall. Eleanor approached the clock with curious steps. It was a historic piece that had originally belonged to her grandfather, Ernest Brooks, and during her childhood, it had been one of the most appreciated pieces of art in the entire house. She observed the beautiful clock face intently. The faded metal hands were pointing exactly to 20 minutes past 6 o'clock. She tried to gently move the hands to the correct time, but nothing occurred, and the mechanism remained completely still. She thought to herself that the internal gears were simply broken and broken down due to decades of neglect. Without giving the matter any further importance, she continued with her evening chores and eventually went to bed. However, the very next morning, she walked by the clock and checked the face once again. The hands were still marking exactly 20 minutes past 6 o'clock, and when she attempted to wind the mechanism, it still did not function at all. It seemed to be a simple, ordinary mechanical failure. Yet, 3 days later, something occurred that truly captured her undivided attention. While she was quietly cleaning the dust from the adjacent hallway, she distinctly heard the clear, rhythmic sound of the grandfather clock ticking smoothly for several seconds. Surprised and intrigued, she walked quickly back into the living room to investigate. The hands were actually moving, advancing slowly across the dial for almost a full minute before coming to a sudden stop once again. To her amazement, they stopped exactly at 20 minutes past 6 o'clock. Eleanor stood motionless, staring at the clock, completely unable to comprehend what was happening. That very same afternoon, Eleanor began to organize a large wall that was entirely filled with old framed family photographs and portraits. Among all the different frames, there was one specific portrait of her mother as a young woman that caught her eye. What caught her attention was the fact that the heavy frame appeared to be slightly tilted to one side. Eleanor reached up to gently straighten the picture, but the moment her fingers touched the wood, she noticed something highly unusual. The frame was secured to the wall with far more firmness and resistance than any of the other pictures around it. In fact, it appeared as if it had been deliberately locked into place to prevent anyone from easily moving or removing it from the wall. That discovery instantly awakened her deepest curiosity, and she decided to try and remove it completely. After making several determined efforts and applying significant pressure, she finally managed to unhook the heavy frame from its mountings. Behind the portrait, she expected to see ordinary wallpaper, but instead, she discovered a small, distinct rectangular outline carved into the surface of the wall, looking as if a hidden opening had existed there at some point in the past. Eleanor passed her hand slowly over the smooth surface, but she could not find any visible button or latch. Even so, the deep sensation that a grand mystery was unfolding began to grow within her heart. First, the secret visits of her mother, then the bizarre behavior of the grandfather clock, and now this hidden wall section. Perhaps they were all just strange coincidences, but she found it increasingly difficult to believe that. That night, she could barely sleep, her mind completely consumed by thoughts of her mother, the specific inheritance, and the words Margaret and Catherine had repeated, "It's worth nothing." Eleanor smiled in the dark, convinced that her mother had chosen this house for a beautiful reason that was yet to be revealed. The very next morning, Eleanor decided to begin an incredibly thorough inspection of the antique furniture that she had not yet explored. She started her search in the small, dusty study room that had once belonged exclusively to her grandfather, Ernest Brooks. Inside the room stood a massive oak bookshelf filled with old ledgers, deteriorated notebooks, and several cardboard boxes packed with decades of family paperwork. The vast majority of the files contained completely mundane information: old utility receipts, faded family letters from distant relatives, and ancient farm invoices. However, while she was carefully examining the very lowest shelf near the floor, her hands brushed against a massive, leather-bound Bible covered by a remarkably thick layer of dust. Eleanor lifted the heavy book with great care, immediately recognizing the magnificent edition. It was the exact Bible that Evelyn had kept on her nightstand for as long as Eleanor could remember. What struck her as highly unusual was the fact that it had been hidden away in this forgotten study rather than being kept with her mother's personal belongings in the city. She sat down comfortably on a wooden chair by the large window, letting the warm sunlight illuminate the pages as she slowly opened the book. As she turned the delicate yellowed pages, a thick, crisp envelope suddenly fell out from between the leaves and landed softly on the wooden floor. Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat significantly faster in her chest as she reached down to pick it up. She recognized the elegant, fluid handwriting instantly. It was indisputably her mother's script, and her name was written across the front. Eleanor remained seated by the window for several minutes, simply holding the heavy envelope in her trembling hands, unable to move a muscle. The simple act of seeing her mother's familiar handwriting after weeks of silence provoked an overwhelming wave of deep emotion and nervous anticipation inside her soul. The soft afternoon light filtered through the glass window, casting a warm glow across the quiet room, while the absolute silence of the countryside house seemed to wrap around her like a warm embrace. She took a deep, steadying breath before carefully sliding her finger under the sealed flap of the envelope, knowing deep down that finding this was no mere accident. Her mother had carefully hidden this letter inside a specific Bible that she knew Eleanor would eventually find, waiting patiently across time for the right moment to arrive. With immense care, she extracted a single, neatly folded sheet of thick paper from the envelope. The paper had grown slightly yellowed around the edges due to the passage of time, but the black ink remained perfectly legible and clear. Eleanor began to read the elegant words silently, her eyes moving slowly across the page. The initial lines were filled with beautiful family memories, describing the joyous moments they had all shared within the walls of this very house, and emphasizing the immense importance of never forgetting one's true family roots. Then, her eyes brushed against a specific sentence that made her breath catch in her throat. "The true treasure of our family has never been kept in a bank account, nor can it be found in fertile lands. It rests precisely where love has always lived." Eleanor read those profound words a second time, and then a third time, trying her absolute best to comprehend the literal meaning behind the poetic phrasing. She knew her mother incredibly well, and Evelyn Brooks never wrote ambiguous or cryptic messages without a very specific, deliberate purpose in mind. She continued reading the letter, but the following paragraphs became even more mysterious and intriguing. Evelyn spoke openly about secrets that had been carefully guarded across multiple generations, about difficult decisions made in the past to protect the family from external greed, and about grand truths that would eventually have to come to light when the time was right. However, she did not explain directly what those secrets were, choosing instead to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for Eleanor to follow. At the very end of the emotional letter, there was a final sentence that left her deeply pensive. "When you finally manage to see what others have completely failed to look at, you will understand exactly why this old house had to come into your hands." Eleanor slowly lowered the paper, her gaze drifting out the window toward the overgrown garden. A multitude of burning questions began to multiply rapidly in her mind. What was it that Margaret and Catherine had failed to see? What grand secret was intimately connected to the architecture of this old house? Why had Evelyn chosen to keep this vital information completely hidden for so many years? As she searched for answers, the memory of Mr. Thomas's words about her mother's secret visits returned to her. Now, everything began to fit into place. Evelyn had been returning here to prepare something important, leaving this letter as the key to a grand puzzle. Meanwhile, several hours away in their luxurious city apartments, Margaret and Catherine were thoroughly enjoying their immense new financial fortunes. For days, they spoke of nothing but lucrative investments, expensive shopping trips, and lavish vacations abroad, fully convinced that they had secured the absolute best portion of their mother's estate. However, a completely casual phone conversation was about to change their perspective. Catherine happened to call an old acquaintance who lived near the countryside property, casually inquiring if Eleanor had actually moved into the old house. The woman on the line confirmed that Eleanor was indeed living there permanently, and mentioned that she spent almost all of her time meticulously reviewing every single room, searching through old documents, and inspecting the historic structure. That piece of information immediately caught Catherine's attention, and a small seed of unease was planted. Later that evening, she shared the news with Margaret during dinner. At first, both sisters laughed loudly, amused by the mental image of Eleanor spending her retirement days sorting through worthless dust and old memories. But the longer they discussed the matter, the more uncomfortable they began to feel. Neither of them could truly comprehend why their mother had been so absolutely insistent on leaving that specific property to Eleanor. Margaret suddenly recalled a strange event from years past. During a family gathering, she had accidentally overheard Evelyn arguing quietly with their grandfather about certain historical documents that needed to remain hidden from the public eye. At that time, she hadn't paid any attention, but now, the memory returned with alarming sharpness. Catherine also began to recall unusual occurrences, and for the very first time, a small doubt appeared in their minds. What if that old house hid something of immense value? Back at the countryside house, Eleanor was determined to continue her investigation. That same evening, she returned to the living room to examine the wall behind the portrait once more, using a powerful flashlight to inspect the rectangular outline. She noticed a tiny detail that she had completely overlooked before. In the upper right corner of the rectangle, there was a very slight difference in the texture of the wood trim. It was almost completely imperceptible to the naked eye. She passed her fingertips slowly over the area until she felt a tiny, rectangular piece of wood that seemed to be slightly loose. She pulled on it with great care, but nothing happened. She tried pushing it inward instead, applying a bit more pressure. Suddenly, she heard a very faint, metallic clicking sound from within the wall, but the panel remained closed. She realized that she needed another piece of the puzzle to activate the mechanism. As the night grew deeper, she decided to rest her tired eyes, preparing a warm cup of tea and sitting down in the living room. It was precisely at that moment that the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly came to life once more, its heavy pendulum swinging smoothly. Eleanor watched in absolute fascination as the hands advanced slowly across the dial for exactly 1 minute before stopping at 20 minutes past 6 o'clock. But this time, she noticed something different. During the brief moment the clock was functioning, she distinctly heard a clear mechanical sound echo from the wall behind the portrait. She jumped up immediately, examining the clock thoroughly, and discovered a tiny inscription engraved at the very base of the clock casing, hidden beneath years of grime. The inscription read simply, "Look behind." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine as she turned her head toward the portrait wall, realizing that the clock, the picture, and the letter were all part of a beautifully designed chain of clues leading her toward a grand revelation. Eleanor stood completely still for several seconds, staring intently at the wall where her mother's beautiful portrait had hung for so many years. The profound words engraved on the base of the old grandfather clock continued to echo clearly in her mind. Look behind. The more she analyzed the situation, the more she realized that absolutely nothing in this house was a coincidence. Her mother had constructed a brilliant, silent guide. She picked up her flashlight and walked back to the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of excitement and fear. She carefully examined the tiny piece of wood trim she had discovered earlier, but this time, keeping the clock's clue in mind, she looked behind the adjacent wooden molding. To her surprise, her fingers brushed against a small, hidden iron lever concealed entirely within the decorative woodwork. She took a deep breath, gripped the cold metal lever, and pulled it downward with all her strength. Instantly, a loud, satisfying mechanical click echoed through the quiet room, and the rectangular section of the wall slowly popped open by a few inches. Eleanor gasped softly, using her hands to gently pull the hidden panel completely open, revealing a dark, secure compartment built deep into the structure of the house. Inside the secret space, there were no sparkling jewels or stacks of cash, but rather a collection of carefully preserved historical items. She found several thick string-tied envelopes, a small leather-bound journal, and a beautiful wooden box carved with intricate floral patterns. She carefully extracted the envelopes first, sitting down at the table to review their contents. To her amazement, the envelopes were filled with old black-and-white photographs of the property from decades ago, along with official-looking land survey maps. Many of the photographs featured her grandfather, Ernest Brooks, standing proudly alongside various professional gentlemen who carried specialized scientific equipment. What caught her attention were the handwritten notes scribbled on the back of each photograph in her grandfather's steady hand, detailing specific geographic coordinates, dates from 40 years ago, and brief, mysterious observations. Several maps had specific areas of the family's land marked with small, precise red ink circles, all pointing toward the northern edge of the property. Next, Eleanor picked up the small leather journal, opening the cover to find her mother's elegant handwriting filling the pages. The journal was a detailed log of Evelyn's secret visits to the house over the past 5 years. She had been meticulously verifying the old maps, consulting historical records, and keeping a quiet watch over the land. On one of the central pages, a single sentence was written in bold ink. Father was entirely correct. The truth remains securely hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right hands. Eleanor read that sentence repeatedly, her mind racing as she tried to connect the dots. What truth was her grandfather referring to? She opened the beautifully carved wooden box next, finding a set of heavy, antique brass keys and a folded piece of architectural paper. She unfolded the paper with immense care, revealing a detailed hand-drawn blueprint of the estate's old barn, a massive wooden structure situated a few hundred yards away from the main house that had been locked and abandoned ever since a severe summer storm had damaged its roof years ago. On the blueprint, a specific corner of the barn's foundation was heavily circled in red ink, and beneath it, Evelyn had written a short note. True value is often disguised as ruin. A profound sense of awe washed over Eleanor. Every single clue was systematically directing her steps away from the comfort of the house and toward the abandoned barn. She knew she needed to investigate the structure, but she also knew she needed more historical context before stepping into the unknown. She remembered Mr. Thomas mentioning an elderly resident named Mr. Vance, who had worked as a surveyor in the region decades ago and had been a close friend of her grandfather. The next morning, she decided to visit him at his modest cottage down the road. The old man welcomed her warmly, his eyes lighting up when she showed him one of the old photographs from the secret compartment. Mr. Vance took a deep breath, touching the faded image with a trembling hand. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, he said softly, a serious expression clouding his face. "Your grandfather went to great lengths to protect this information from the wrong people, Eleanor. There were greedy individuals back then who wanted to strip this land away from him, so he hid the truth until the legal protections were ironclad." Eleanor returned to her house late that evening, her mind absolutely overflowing with the fascinating historical context Mr. Vance had shared. She now understood that her family had been protecting a monumental secret for generations, and she held the keys to finally unlocking it. As she sat at her dining table, carefully organizing the maps and photographs, she suddenly heard the distinct, loud sound of an engine approaching the house along the gravel driveway. She walked quickly to the window, peering out into the twilight, and felt an immediate wave of intense discomfort. A sleek, expensive black car had just come to a stop in front of the porch, and she watched as Margaret and Catherine stepped out, followed closely by a sharp-eyed gentleman dressed in an expensive corporate suit. Eleanor recognized him immediately as Mr. Towle, Richard Sterling, a notoriously ruthless attorney who specialized in aggressive estate disputes and property acquisitions in the city. The three of them walked toward the porch with an air of absolute determination, their faces completely devoid of any familial warmth. It was abundantly clear to Eleanor that her sisters had discovered that something valuable was hidden within the property, and they had brought legal enforcement to demand their share of whatever she was about to find. The heavy wooden front door rattled loudly as Margaret knocked with aggressive impatience. Eleanor took a deep, calming breath, smoothed down her blouse, and opened the door, standing firmly on the threshold. Margaret did not even bother to offer a polite greeting. She pushed past Eleanor into the hallway, followed closely by Catherine and Mr. Sterling, who carried a thick leather briefcase. "We need to talk immediately, Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice sharp and demanding as she looked around the hallway with calculating eyes. "We know you've been digging through Mother's old things, and we have reason to believe that this property holds significant assets that were completely omitted from the primary estate valuation." Eleanor maintained her absolute composure, gesturing toward the living room. "Please sit down," she said calmly, refusing to let their aggressive energy intimidate her. They accommodated themselves on the old sofa, while Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase, extracting several legal documents. "Miss Brooks," the attorney began in a cold, professional tone, "my clients have retained my services to formally review the execution of their mother's last will. We believe there has been a substantial lack of transparency regarding the true value of this countryside property, and we are prepared to file a formal injunction in New York City to freeze any actions regarding this estate until a full forensic audit is completed." Eleanor listened to the attorney's threats in absolute silence, her expression completely unreadable. Catherine leaned forward, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and greed. "You thought you could keep it all for yourself, didn't you, Eleanor? You always acted so simple and innocent, but the moment Mother passes away, you run out here to claim a hidden fortune. We are her daughters too, and we are entitled to 2/3 of whatever is on this land." Eleanor looked at her sisters with a profound sense of sadness in her heart, realizing how completely consumed they were by material wealth. "I have found absolutely nothing but old family memories and historical photographs," Eleanor replied quietly, choosing to keep her discoveries entirely to herself for the time being. Mother left me this house because she knew I would cherish it, not for any financial gain. Margaret let out a harsh, skeptical laugh. We don't believe you for a single second, Eleanor. Mr. Sterling will be filing the legal paperwork tomorrow morning, and we suggest you cooperate fully unless you want to spend your retirement wrapped up in an incredibly expensive legal battle. After delivering their harsh ultimatum, the three of them stood up and marched out of the house, slamming the door behind them. Eleanor watched their car speed away into the darkness, knowing that she was now locked in a desperate race against time. She had to find the truth hidden in the barn before her sister's legal team could intervene. The very next morning, before the sun had even fully risen above the horizon, Eleanor walked out to the old abandoned barn, carrying the antique brass keys and her grandfather's detailed blueprint. The morning air was sharp and freezing, and a thick layer of mist hung low over the grass as she approached the massive, weathered wooden structure. The heavy double doors were secured by a thick, rusted iron chain and a massive padlock that looked as if it hadn't been touched in 40 years. She selected the largest brass key from the ring, inserted it into the padlock, and turned it with all her strength. With a loud metallic crack, the rusted lock finally snapped open, and Eleanor carefully unwrapped the heavy chains. She pushed the heavy wooden doors open with a loud, groaning sound, stepping into the dark, cavernous interior of the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay, dried dust, and aged timber, and beams of pale morning sunlight filtered through the cracked roof, illuminating millions of floating dust motes. Eleanor walked slowly through the space, consulting the blueprint in her hands, her eyes focused on the far northern corner of the building's stone foundation. According to her grandfather's drawing, the secret lay precisely where the morning shadow of the main roof beam intersected with the stone floor. She waited patiently for several minutes as the sun slowly rose higher, watching the long shadow shift across the ground, until the tip of the shadow pointed directly to a massive, rectangular stone slab embedded deep into the earth. Eleanor knelt down on the cold ground, using a small brush to clear away decades of dirt and dried straw from the edges of the stone slab. As she cleaned the surface, she discovered a small iron ring recessed into a groove in the stone. She gripped the ring tightly, bracing her feet against the floor, and pulled upward with a tremendous amount of effort. The heavy stone slab groaned as it slowly lifted, revealing a dark, concrete-lined staircase descending straight into the earth beneath the barn. Eleanor turned on her powerful flashlight, its bright beam cutting through the darkness as she carefully walked down the narrow steps. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself standing in a large, clean, underground bunker that had been meticulously constructed decades ago. The room was lined with heavy metal shelving units, containing dozens of neatly organized archival boxes, scientific core sample tubes, and legal folders. Eleanor walked over to the main desk in the center of the room, where a thick, leather-bound binder rested prominently. She opened the binder, and as her eyes scanned the official geological reports, engineering data, and certified assay documents inside, her heart practically stopped beating. The comprehensive scientific documents, verified by top independent experts 40 years ago, confirmed that an absolutely massive, high-grade vein of natural gold ore ran directly beneath the family's entire countryside estate. The estimated financial value of the mineral deposit was staggering, amounting to tens of millions of dollars, completely dwarfing the value of the city bank accounts and agricultural lands her sisters had inherited. Eleanor sat back in the chair, completely overwhelmed, finally understanding the true magnitude of her mother's brilliant secret. Eleanor sat in the quiet underground sanctuary for what felt like hours, her eyes staring blankly at the highly detailed geological maps spread out across the wooden desk. The absolute magnitude of the discovery was completely overwhelming to her spirit. She was sitting directly on top of an immense fortune that could easily transform her life and the lives of generations to come. But as she turned the pages of the thick master binder, she discovered a personal, handwritten letter from her mother tucked into the very back pocket of the folder. She extracted the paper with trembling fingers, her eyes filling with tears as she began to read Evelyn's final, intimate words. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading these words, it means your beautiful heart has guided you to the truth that your grandfather and I protected for so many years. We always knew this wealth existed beneath our feet, but we also witnessed how the mere rumor of this gold destroyed friendships and bred toxic greed in our community decades ago. Your grandfather chose to seal this vault until the proper legal frameworks were established to ensure the land could never be exploited by destructive corporate entities. I watched your older sisters grow into women who value nothing but the immediate gleam of money, and I knew that if I left this land to them, they would instantly sell it to the highest bidding mining conglomerate, destroying this beautiful valley and displacing our neighbors for a quick profit. I left this sacred responsibility to you, Eleanor, because I knew you possessed the wisdom, the patience, and the profound love for humanity required to manage this blessing. This gold does not belong to you to hoard. It is a sacred trust meant to uplift this entire community and protect our beautiful home forever. Use it wisely, my beautiful child, and remember that true wealth is measured solely by the goodness we bring into the world. Eleanor wept quietly as she held the emotional letter against her chest, feeling a deep, unbreakable connection to her mother's noble spirit. She understood perfectly now. The inheritance was not a simple gift of luxury, but a monumental test of character and a profound social responsibility. She carefully packed the vital legal folders, geological certificates, and her mother's personal letters into a secure bag, locked the underground vault securely, and returned to the main house just as the afternoon sun began to fill the valley. She knew she needed immediate, powerful legal protection to counter her sister's impending lawsuit, so she reached out to an exceptionally reputable, high-principled attorney in New York City named Mr. Jonathan Vance, the son of her grandfather's old friend, who immediately agreed to take her case. 2 days later, a formal preliminary hearing was convened in a grand courtroom in the city, where Margaret, Catherine, and Mr. Sterling sat confidently, fully prepared to dismantle Eleanor's sole ownership of the Countryside estate. Mr. Countryside, Sterling stood up before the judge, presenting an aggressive argument that the property had been grossly undervalued during the initial probate process and demanding that the court void Evelyn's specific bequest to Eleanor. However, the momentum of the room completely shifted when Mr. Jonathan Vance stood up to present Eleanor's formal defense. Instead of arguing about property lines or real estate values, he calmly submitted the certified historical documents, the legal corporate structures established by Ernest Brooks, and the explicit, ironclad environmental land trusts that Evelyn had legally tied to the property title years before her passing. He also presented the conclusive geological reports, revealing the true nature of the estate to the astonished judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Vance stated firmly, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, the late Evelyn Brooks did not hide any assets from her daughters. She left the city wealth to the clients who valued material gain, and she left this specific, heavily protected land trust to the one daughter who was legally bound by her mother's explicit terms to preserve the environment and use the resources exclusively for community development. The text of the last will is entirely absolute, unambiguous, and legally flawless." The judge thoroughly reviewed the extensive, immaculate documentation for several minutes, looking down at Margaret and Catherine with a stern expression. With a sharp rap of his gavel, the judge issued his final, definitive ruling, completely upholding Eleanor's exclusive, absolute ownership of the property and dismissing her sister's lawsuit with prejudice, ending their greedy pursuit permanently. Margaret and Catherine sat frozen in their chairs, their faces pale with absolute shock and bitter disappointment as they realized they had completely lost access to the monumental fortune because of their own historical disdain for the old house. They left the courtroom without saying a single word to Eleanor, their hearts heavy with resentment and regret. Eleanor watched them go with a calm, peaceful heart, completely free of any malice or bitterness toward them, wishing only that they would find peace within themselves. She returned immediately to her beautiful countryside home, eager to begin the noble work her mother had envisioned. Over the following months, Eleanor utilized the immense financial resources from the Underground Gold Trust to quietly establish the Evelyn Brooks Foundation, a magnificent philanthropic organization dedicated to uplifting the entire rural community. She did not purchase luxury cars or mansions for herself. Instead, she remained living happily in the historic house, which she beautifully restored using local craftsmen. The foundation funded the construction of a modern medical clinic, established generous educational scholarships for every child in the valley, and provided robust financial support for the elderly residents who had spent their lives working the land. The once faded community began to blossom beautifully, filled with new opportunities, vibrant energy, and a profound sense of security. As the years advanced gracefully, Eleanor found herself surrounded by a massive, loving community that viewed her as a cherished matriarch and a source of boundless inspiration. She had taken a weathered, forgotten inheritance that her own family had mocked and dismissed as completely worthless, and through the pure power of love, wisdom, and selflessness, she had transformed it into a legacy of enduring goodness that would protect the valley for generations to come. True wealth, as Eleanor had so beautifully demonstrated to the world, never truly resided in the cold glitter of gold or the heavy numbers in a bank ledger, but rather in the profound, lasting impact we leave upon the hearts of others. Life has a beautiful, mysterious way of unfolding its deepest truths to those who walk through the world with an open soul, a patient mind, and an unwavering commitment to kindness. When we choose to look beyond the immediate, superficial promises of material gain and status, we begin to perceive the quiet, enduring treasures that time can never diminish or erode. The greatest lessons of our existence are almost always taught through the quiet trials of patience, requiring us to trust the intentions of those who came before us and to honor their wisdom with our own actions. True maturity is found when we realize that the blessings we receive are never meant to be tightly hoarded for our own comfort, but are rather meant to be shared generously as a powerful force for healing, growth, and upliftment in a world that so deeply hungers for genuine compassion. In the twilight of our years, when the superficial noise of ambition fades into silence, the only things that truly remain to comfort our spirits are the memories of the love we gave away, the families we helped protect, and the quiet, humble spaces where we chose to build a sanctuary of enduring peace for those who follow in our footsteps. Eleanor looked out across the sunlit valley from her porch, her soul filled with an absolute, beautiful serenity, knowing with absolute certainty that her beloved mother was smiling down upon her from above, her final wish beautifully fulfilled.